Hi friends, welcome to this latest episode of the Nationalist View, and we have with us a very special guest, Dr. Soumya Avasthi. Dr. Soumya Avasthi, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you so much, Arunji.
Dr. Soumya Avasthi is a fellow with Observer Research Foundation, a leading global think tank, and today we are going to talk about her latest book. She has written and edited several books, and a detailed bio of Dr. Avasthi and links of her latest works will also be there in the description box. You can access that. So, we are going to talk about this book and diverse narratives and shared beliefs, classical to hybrid Deoband Islam in South Asia. It's a wonderful book. I have read the complete book, and we are going to talk about Deoband Islam and the various, influences, the impact of Deoband Islam. So, Dr. Vasti, give us a little bit of a historical background about, the origin of Deoband Islam and how it has evolved over the, decades or centuries.
So Deoband Islam has its origin in India, very much in British India, when and its trigger point was basically 1857 revolt, the first war of independence, that some people from Saharanpur, Meerut, and all. So the mutiny was something which triggered this movement, I would say. And 10 years after 1857, in around 1866, we saw the genesis of Deoband movement. So Deoband is a small town in Saharanpur, Uttar Pradesh, which is close to Uttarakhand, foothills of Uttarakhand. And there is a big seminary, which was earlier a small place for people to come and do religious discussions and read Quran and all of that. So it was never a big mosque, or there was never a big mosque or a big university. But in 1866, when there was so much of resistance against the British rule in India, that's when the Deobandi movement came in picture, because the ulemas of that place thought that British were not there just to mint money out of the country, but also spread their own influence in the country, whether it was through educational changes, through politics, the divide and rule policy that they implemented, and things like that. So, keeping in mind the direct threat that they feared towards India and also towards religion, they came together under the leadership of Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanavati. He is considered to be one of the key proponents of the Deobandi movement. So, along with Rashid Ahmad Gangoi and certain people from the Madni family, they all came together, decided that we need to do something in order to secure, save, protect the religion. So it was more about purification of Islam from the cultural innovations that were happening due to education. And they emphasize that we need to protect the law and text of religion, Islam, so that the purity of Islam is not under any kind of change. And what was it? Basically, they started this whole movement where they had talked about supporting the Ottoman Caliphate also. At that time, they wrote a letter. Silk Letter is a very famous conspiracy movement that in Hindi it is called Rumal Tehreek. And that movement was also against the Britishers who were fighting against the Ottomans. So the movement was stretched from India to the Caliphate, Ottoman Empire at that time. And so they wanted to protect the interpretation of Islam, and they said that Deobandis follow Ashari Maturidi thought, which is basically combination of two different thought process, which is one has its origin in Iraq, and the other has it in Central Asia, which is close modern day Uzbekistan. So the Asharis and Maturidis are again two schools of thought, and so they follow that, and it's called Ahle Sunnat wal Jamaat. Now I'm smiling only because it's a very confusing at first go, but it's not that confusing. I'll take few minutes just to explain to the listeners that what I'm talking. There is two schools of thought, Shias and Sunnis. Schools or sects, sorry. There are two sects, Shias and Sunni. So under Sunni, there are four schools of jurisprudence, or you can say four schools of law. Hanafi, Hanabali, Maliki, and Shafi. Now, under the Hanafi school of thought comes the Deobandis, Barelvis, and under Hanabali, you can say the most famous one is the Wahhabi or the Salafi Islam or the Ahle Hadith. So this is we'll talk only about the most famous ones, and within this the Hanafi school is followed broadly in South Asia, and some part of it is also followed in modern day. It traveled across some European countries, also follow it. Hanbali restricted itself to West Asia, Saudi Arabia region, and Middle East, all of that. And the Malaki and Shafi traveled further, far from South Asia towards Africa, in Southeast Asia, and all these places. So this is what is, in short, the four schools of jurisprudence. And within the Hanafi comes the Ashari and Maturidi. So they are named after the famous scholars. So if you say Hanafi, so it was actually a scholar named Muhammad Hanafi, under whose name this series started, or the lineage started. And similarly, the Asharis and Maturidis. Now, so this is what the Deobands in India started following, and they fought again along with the thought to protect their own religion. They also wanted to contribute towards India's freedom struggle, and that's how we saw their role in the First War of Independence, in later on in the Khilafat movement, and all of that. The other theological difference or interpretation is that they accept Sufism, but they strictly forbid people visiting the graves or celebrating any death anniversary. फॉर एग्जाम्पल उर्स का मेला हो गया, या फिर कई तरीके की ईद होती हैं, तो उनमें से कुछ ईद हैं जो नहीं, जिसमें हम ग्रेव पे जाते हैं. सो फॉर एग्जाम्पल दिल्ली हैज अ हजरत निजामुद्दीन दरगाह. So they will say that we respect him because he is a follower of Prophet Muhammad, but we do not bow in front of them. That is what the Sufi shrine culture in Deoband is. That we will not celebrate all that, and they in fact discourage the celebration of birthday of Prophet Muhammad also, because they say that this birthday concept is very modern and it is influenced by Western interpretation, and there is no concept of Prophet Muhammad's birthday. So this is what the Deobandi movement in India was all about, and they also believed in you know uh, interpretation, not entirely different, but they don't say that we are modern interpretation, but they say that there is an acceptance for little bit of change as per the time. So they are at least open to the conversation of debate in the Deoband movement.
So how is it different from Barelvi Islam?
Like Deoband started in India, same way Barelvis also started from Indian subcontinent, and it started later than the Deobandis. It started in the 19th century. Barelvi movement started in Bareli, which is again part of Uttar Pradesh, and its key founder is Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan Barelvi, and he said that we need to preserve the traditional and devotional Sufi practices of South Asia along with the religious interpretation. And for example, in Deoband, they say that Prophet Muhammad was just a human messenger, and he is spiritually alive but in his grave. So he is respected, but they don't say he is the God. And Barelvi say that, he is a divine light, and he is someone who has witnessed the true creation of universe, and hence we should worship him as a Noor. And so they equate him to the level of God. Whereas Sunnis, the Deobandis say, no, he is not a God, he is just a messenger of the God. God is not anywhere you can see. Second difference is that the Barelvis they encourage people to visit the dargahs, the graves, and they feel that there is, this visiting of the Sufi shrines like Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, Salim Chishti, and the famous mazar of all these people. They are the middle people or the middlemen who will connect us to Prophet Muhammad. So they look for the Sufi saints as the bridge between them and the Prophet, whereas it is highly rejected in the case of Deobandis. And they celebrate the Prophet Muhammad's birthday with lot of pomp and show. And it's one of the most important festivals for Barelvis. And then the other difference between the Barelvis is that and Barelvis and Deobandis is that they are they have the deep theological divide. It is mostly related to the interpretation. So the competition between Deobandis and Barelvis is more about whose interpretation is considered most closest to the religion. So that is how I define the difference between these two. Uh,
So, in your book, you have classified Devband Islam in three categories: classical, neoclassical, and hybrid.
yeah.
And you have largely said, that uh, classical Devband Islam is primarily, we find it in India. Pakistan is an example of neoclassical, and Afghanistan is an example of hybrid Devband Islam. So, what is the difference amongst these three strands and how they have evolved?
So in my book, and this is just to claim fame here, these three are the new taxonomy that I have given to the literature on Islamic studies and political Islam. And the reason was simple, just because whenever you talk about Deoband, there is one thing which comes out, that Deoband is highly radical and fundamentalist, and they shelter terrorism and they promote terrorism. So probably in some manner it has been true when you see facts on the ground, starting with what happened in 9/11 to what we see happening in Pakistan. So there is this understanding that all that is happening in Deoband is anti-state, and not are anti-state, anti-national elements are there. So I wanted to bring this difference because when you associate Deoband to terrorism, we must also know that Deoband is originating in India. So are we, is the Western thinker trying to say that India promotes Deobandism and Deobandism promotes terrorism? So it's the question of, that possibility, the probability question. So I thought that let's differentiate and make it more simplify for the Western listeners and readers, because it's not as simple as they think of it. So I wanted to say that the Deoband in India is a classical Deoband, which is which originates in India, which it has certain kind of interpretations, certain good, certain bads, and they exist in a different form, and you cannot equate it to what is happening in Pakistan. So my qualm or my problem is people equating Deoband of India with a Deoband of Pakistan, because it's stark opposite. And the Deoband in Pakistan is what I call as Neo Deoband, because they have moved from India to Pakistan. They wanted to have the nation identity associated with religion, whereas India's identity was and is not associated with any religion, but with culture and tradition. So that is one difference between the Deoband of India and Pakistan. So it's Neo Deoband because it's walking away from the classical interpretation of Deoband. And they are saying that the identity of a nation state is based on religion, and they wanted to participate in politics of Pakistan. The creation of Pakistan, the Pakistan movement itself was highly influenced by the ulemas, and they were very much Deobandis, of course, but they did not align with the freedom movement of India. They did not believe in the nationalism of India. or Hindustan or Bharat, that these terms were used in the debates back then. So they did not align with the thought of nationalism of India, and they said that we want to move out. So there were certain Deobandi philosophy ulemas who aligned themselves with Pakistan movement and went to Pakistan with the hope that they will get more say and control in the nation building, constitution, politics. And somewhere they forgot that the authentic role of Deoband was only limited to religious practices. It was never about politics for Deoband. But when they went to Pakistan, they wanted to be part of politics as well. So that is what Neo Deoband is. It is highly radical, it is highly extremist and fundamentalist. And they were rejectionist. So these are few terms I have used in my book also, that how the Deobandis of India are accommodative because they wanted to live amongst the the other religions, coexist, and yet secure their identity as Islamic people. Whereas the Pakistani Muslims or the Deobandi followers were rejectionists. They believe that it's only the Sunnis who are humans and have all the rights to be in Pakistan. Rest all non-Sunnis, non-Deobandis are apostate or kafirs, and they have no right to be in the land of Pakistan because Pakistan is a pure land of Islam. So that is why they are rejectionist and fundamentalist and radical, because you see the role of terror groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jahangvi, and Sipai Sahaba. All these groups, Jaish-e-Mohammed, all these groups emerging in Pakistan. Now, coming to Deoband in Afghanistan, I call it hybrid Deoband because unfortunately, the people of Afghanistan who themselves still associate more to Indian Deoband, and they say that we are Deobandis of India, and time and again they say it. It is something very humbling also at times to listen from them. And because I went to Afghanistan in 2019, they showed that they have certain they align themselves to the classical Deoband, but the geopolitics of that region unfortunately did not let it be like a classical Deoband, and majority of its role goes to Pakistan, because they, under the leadership of Zia ul Haq, wanted to bring Islamized policies, and the mushrooming of the madrasas along the Arkora Khatak and Northwest province led to this mixing of religion with geopolitics and also the tribal law of the land. So this is why I say in simple terms, let's keep it as hybrid Deoband because it has three broad components. One is Deoband. The second is Wahhabi interpretation, because if we discuss further on geopolitics, we realize the major role played by the United States and the Saudi Arabia and the petro money which came in, which was channeled through Pakistan. So there was Wahhabi influence heavily on the Deoband of Afghanistan. And the third component, which is again a very, very important component, is the Pashtun Wali, which is the moral law of conduct which exists in the Pashtun land of Afghanistan. So because they are tribally very strong, they are very rooted in their tribal laws. So these three components somewhere changed the authentic interpretation of Deoband, and hence they became hybrid in my language. So this is in so much so that Deoband in classical is India, which is accommodative yet very fundamentalist. Deoband of Pakistan is Neo Deoband, which is rejectionist but radical and extremist. The third is hybrid Deoband of Afghanistan, which is mixture of three components, and somewhere they are accommodative to the fact that we want to be part of India, but they are rejectionist because again they do not accept the Shias of Hazara land as part of Afghanistan.
So, Dr. Avasti very well put it. I think these are very important new terms which you have given, the hybrid and neoclassical Deoband Islam. And I'm sure basically, that is going to and I'm sure that is going to, kind of create a lot of impact in the international arena, and it will help the Westerners to understand, to have a better understanding rather than looking at it from a very simplistic lens.
Yes.
And so I want to talk a little bit more about Pakistan. Now, what role Devband Islam has played in shaping Pakistan's power dynamics, given there is a substantial Shia population also there? So, what role it has played? As you had mentioned that Devbandis came to Pakistan, so they thought that they will be able to play
Yeah.
a substantial role in shaping Pakistan's power dynamics. So, have they been able to do so? How much is their impact, and how their impact has evolved over the years since 1947?
So definitely, whether it is good or bad, we'll conclude that in the second section of the answer. But they did play a very, very important role in the shaping of Pakistan's power dynamics, and especially when you talk about the politics and the creation, the whole project of Pakistan, because many of these Deobandi scholars who were opposed to the opposed to the greater land of India, the Akhand Bharat that we talk about. So they wanted to move towards Pakistan. So they created this Jamaat-e-Ulama Islam, which supported the Pakistan project. And it started influencing the politics by trying to force themselves into the constitutional writing and defining who will be the right citizens of Pakistan, and how the role of army will be. Somewhere the vengeance of the partition also was carried along by these Pakistan supporting Deobandi ulemas, and they got the peak of it came only in 1970 when under Muhammad Ziaul Haq, the Islamization policies began. And they started, so it was actually this Ziaul Haq who aligned more closely to the Deobandi network of Pakistan. And they thought that together they can become force multiplier and, excuse me, and strengthen the movement. And so Zia-ul Haq had this ambition of being the founder of the true puritanical Islam and make Pakistan part of the Pan-Islamic project. And they saw the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as one of the doorways or the headways. And so, like I said, that they started mushrooming these madrasas to build the jihadi army and launch them into Afghanistan and fight the Soviets, and all of that happens. They took the opportunity. So I think the religious leadership of Pakistan understood that if they want to remain in power, they need to choose side, and the side which is more powerful. And by the late 1970s, they had already seen the involvement of United States in the Eurasian region. So they started talking the language of United States, which comforts them, and then a lot of money can come into their country, which they can use to expand the madrasa network. And hence the ulemas, of course, if you have religious schools, you need religious leaders. So it was a win-win for the ulemas of Pakistan, that this is how we can control the politics or shape the narrative of Pakistan. And so the political religious ecosystem started linking itself to the seminaries. Political parties started coming up. Sipai Sahaba is one of the major parties which began, and the militant actors also started getting more and more space in the political dynamics, because it is money and muscle which leads the control of the state building or the nation building of Pakistan. So the militants started getting control of these madrasas, and they were grooming more and more youth and madrasa students into radical Islam. And they painted a picture that, it is the duty of a true Islamic person or a true Muslim to fight against the non-Muslims, and hence jihad shapes in Pakistan. So the power dynamics is not remain or restricted only to the political ecosystem, but also it travels into the religious foray and how jihad movement started. It just does not stop there, but in fact, they also start seeing their own people, the Shias, as the enemy of Pakistan. And they also see the coming of blasphemy laws. So a lot of these laws also changes in Pakistan because of the influence of the ulemas of Pakistan. So the Deobandi ulemas introduced in the constitution the blasphemy law, which says that anything uttered against Prophet Muhammad will be considered as a crime, and the punishment is only death. So death penalty is the ultimate punishment, and that has been very well politicized in Pakistan. uh, from time to time they have used it. Salman Taseer's famous case, Asia Bibi case, is well known, and in fact, we see that how the whole movement started shifting, and then you see the role of Barelvis also coming in over there. But sticking to the whole power dynamics, I think they continue to play a role which has been detrimental for the people of Pakistan, which in some cases the citizens of Pakistan have also realized that how badly the the ulemas have shaped the Pakistan state, and what is their standing in the global world order, where people are always suspicious, and no matter how much they deny the emergence of non-state actors and terrorism from Pakistan, I think it's has been recognized globally, and it's not for India alone, but for the global audience, because they started sheltering people like Osama bin Laden, whom they revered as a big, fighter and savior of Islam against the apostates of United States. And then you also see the Haqqani network, which again is a very important key player in the jihadi narrative or the landscape, because the Akora Khatak region has this Haqqani madrasa, which is very very famous. And Binori town again has Jaish-e Mohammed uh, hub, and these are controlling the power there. So if you see, whichever side these ulemas go, that party starts winning, because they are seen as crowd pullers, mobilizers, and vote bank. And hence, you see that it's not just the political leadership who understands the importance of religion, but it is also the religious leaders who understand their importance. And so they do arm twisting of the politics also. So they do play a very important role, and I see it in a very negative way that uh, the potential of Pakistan could have been better if they were limited to a certain section. The religion was limited, but they have badly screwed it for themselves.
So let's talk about the global expanse of Deoband Islam. You have mentioned about the transnational impact of Deoband Islam. So if you can tell our viewers, that what is the extent of this global expanse and influence of Deoband Islam? Has it gone, beyond South Asia, and what role it has played in terms of promoting radicalization?
So yes, Deoband has gained a global phenomena, and it has expanded outside South Asia or the Indian subcontinent. Simple one analogy I want to draw here is that if you consider Al-Azhar of Cairo, Egypt, as the Mecca of education of Islam, in that sense, Deoband is considered number two. That is the stature it has gained in the global field of Islamic education, the Deoband Islam. So, in terms of education, of course, Deoband Madrasas, Deoband Darul Uloom has earned itself a big respect globally. But also, if you look at it from the madrasa network, interpretation, followers, it has not remained only within South Asia. It has expanded globally, starting from missionary movement like Tablighi Jamaat, which is again not only limited to India, Pakistan, or Afghanistan or beyond. But it has also traveled to Europe, to Central Asia, to Southeast Asia. In fact, Southeast Asia Tablighi Jamaat movement is very strong. And then you have the Deobandi ideas spreading across, Africa, Central Asia, Europe, and Kingdom, and North America and South Africa also. So they have expanded. This expansion has happened only because of the madrasa network, the missionary movement, and also the state sponsored export also. So it's not the individual just traveling and migrating to a new city and opening up a madrasa, but it is also a state sponsored exercise where leaders are involved. They are sending their missionaries to settle and collaborate and open a new madrasa or a seminary. And it has always started with a small Quran reading circle. So it doesn't go and establish one day as a big infrastructure, but it starts at a very local community level and it expands. And because the Deoband has earned itself the stature of being the second best, so wherever they travel, they automatically get that respect. And so when you get that respect, you are asked to open your branch, like Akash teaching centers, or so they multiply and they mushroom. So there are people who will do donation in the name of zakat, and then that zakat money is translated into establishing a madrasa back there. If I talk about South Asia, then of course, Bangladesh also has a majority Deobandi followers, and they again influence a lot in the politics and the whole movement of what we saw in Bangladesh in the early this year and last year. The movement was led on the basis of religion and Deobandi interpretation and things like that. So they have expanded, they have influenced globally. In fact, when you talk about the debate on education, jurisprudence, identity, all of these places, the Deobandi scholarships have produced certain kind of authority, and their readings are changing. So Imam Bukhari has, for example, uh, interpreted and written several hadith, interpreted hadith for their Muslim population, and now they are being reinterpreted by the present day scholars also. One interesting thing that I have also talked about in the book while talking about global influence is that how there are three stages of interpretation of Quran that we saw. It starts with formative period, then there is a middle period, and then there is a modern period. So there also you see how the flavor of radicalism has changed. It has grown and in size and length. So this modern day interpretation of Islam or Quran has actually brought in a lot of radicalization, uh, because they have taken the context out of Quran, and that is the problem for the religion, and that is something that they need to fix within their religion. All these scholars who are moderate, they need to come together and do this movement where they bring the context back to the discussion, because now what they follow is Ahmad Faraz and this Abdullah Azam and Ibn Taymiyyah, their interpretations are being followed. So, for example, Ghazwa Hind, we talk so much about Ghazwa Hind, but if you talk to the learned Deobandi scholars, they say that Ghazwa Hind doesn't exist in Quran. It was part of Sunnah, it was part of Hadith, and so it is something which is not instructed by the Prophet Muhammad onto the people of Makkah and Medina. It was in a very limited context of the war of when the war was taking, when the migration was happening between between the Makkah and Medina and the people of Middle East and West Asia. It was of that time Ghazwa Hind concept was there. So if you talk to the learned scholar, they say that no, it's not there. Quran doesn't talk about it. But the people like Zakir Naik and his likes talk about Ghazwa Hind. If you look at Pakistan, Jaish-e Mohammed, they talk about Ghazwa Hind. the this what do you call Lashkar-e-Toiba, they talk about Ghazwa Hind. So it's not part. Now, what the duty of the scholars in Deoband, or the learned scholar of Deoband who are understanding well this thing, should come together and bring that change, because radicalization is emerging from these interpretations. And now what you see is reinforcement of their identity and militancy emerging from there. So 9/11 was one of the biggest events in the global history, where we saw that militancy was, or radicalization was the source of that act. And even today, when you look at the uh, the madrasas of Pakistan or the madrasas of Bangladesh, they all are into radicalization, mobilization, and they have now started targeting women of the family. Islamic State again is big example where they have been targeting women to do radicalization. So Deoband, unfortunately, whether it is neo Deoband or hybrid Deoband or classical Deoband, has unfortunately been playing a little role in radicalization through misinterpretation and not being checked by them.
No, last question is, no, Deoband in India, the Deoband school in India or Deoband Islam in India, so they took a contrarian position or basically expressed their disagreement with abrogation of Article 370 from Jammu Kashmir, integrating Jammu and Kashmir fully constitutionally with India. They also have taken a contrarian stand on provisions like, this Citizen Amendment Act, CAA, and also the NRC. So on a lot of issues, even I think on triple talaq also they have taken a contrarian stand.
Yes.
So how do you see the future of Deoband Islam in India in light of this contrarian stance which they are taking? And so how do you see the future of Deoband Islam in India?
Yes, there have been contrarian views on certain issues, as you highlighted, and I can only say that it has been shaped over a period of time the way it is. Because if I reflect on a small example of Hussain Ahmad Madani, who is again a revered figure in Deoband Islam, and his father was also one of the persons of Deoband movement who's remained in India, and they talked about composite nationalism, which means that non-Muslims and Muslims can live together and they can have a common nation state and things like that. But now you see that there is a divergence of view happening, which is not just based on religion, but they are also trying to get this influence externally. That they want to have a say in the politics also. So you raise the point of triple talaq, and I recall my visit to Deoband in Darul Uloom Deoband, where I talked about it, and they said that we understand that triple talaq is not a concept that is part of Islamic interpretation, and it is not practiced in many countries. We understand, but what we felt bad is that we are not included into the discussion of these issues. When CA and RC was happening, there was a large opposition which came from the madrasas, which came from the network of these of the Islamic community or the Muslim community of India, which was then doused by certain people also, like Imam Bukhari stood on the parapet of the um, Jama Masjid and said that CA and RC is not anti-Muslim in any form. So there have been, I think, this kind of thought exists within Islam, within Deoband, only because there is more to it than just religion. I feel that they are trying to have a say from the political perspective also. And if they want to have it, they are more welcome to do it. But when you say the future of Deoband, I think it also depends that how the people of Deoband are coming out and talking on these issues. They may say that in a closed door that government of India is right and CA is not anti-Muslim in any form. NRC will not throw the Indian Muslims out of India. And I think they वो प्रत्यक्ष किम प्रमाणम की what you see is what you witness, and that is the truth. So they have witnessed that none of the Muslims were sent out of India. It was only more Muslims were welcomed in India. So that understanding has to come, and I think only when they start talking openly about it in public, they join hand and they talk about it in the feeling of composite nationalism, as one of their own leaders say. Only then the future of Deoband Islam in India will be more composite, more um, you know uh, integrated, because integration is a problem right now. And I understand that they don't want us to intrude into their madrasa centric authority model and intellectualism that they feel is engaging. But at the same time, if they look at madrasas also as a power center, they should engage more with modern tools like technology, education. Bringing those reforms is very important. So these are some of the challenges, structural challenges that exist in the Deoband movement, Deoband in India also. And only thing that I feel can change the undercurrents that they have right now is if they understand the aspiration of the youth of the modern Muslim today in India. They respect their religion, but they also want certain taste of modern day life, which can improve their quality of life and improve their ambitions and fulfill their ambitions as better humans, better citizens. So for that, I think Deoband has to be a little more inclusive, little bit open to the idea of exchanging of best practices, and that's when we will see more composition and composite nationalism emerging from that sector of society.
Thank you, Dr. Avasthi, and our best wishes for writing such a wonderful book. I'm sure the book is doing well and it is going to do well. It's a must read for not only scholars, researchers, journalists, and public people who are participating in public discourse, but I think it's a must read for everyone who wants to understand the evolution of Islam in India also, and which is very important. And again, the book is based on a lot of extensive field work, which, as Dr. Vasti was also mentioning in the conversation, that she visited Afghanistan. She also, visited and interviewed, a number of people in Darul Uloom, Deoband, at Saharanpur as well as in Lucknow, apart from other places. And you can actually basically see the outcome of these interviews. So it has been also part of the book, so it's a pretty good empirical research also. And I would highly recommend this book. And we hope to see your next book very soon, though I know, it takes a lot of time to write these, such kind of books. So, and thank you viewers for watching, and thank you, Dr. Avasti, for taking time out from your busy schedule and joining this conversation and sharing your thoughts. Thank you very much.
My honor and pleasure always coming and talking on this platform. And thank you to the listeners through your platform. And I look forward to the next conversation. Thank you.